Hi all, we're delighted to begin with our keynote for the afternoon. You'll see it. In certain glamorous worlds, we know people by their first name. We know Barack, we know who we're talking about. We know Newt, we know Jack and Jackie. In Hollywood, we have Angelina and Brad. We have George, we have the ubiquitous Jack. We used to have Carrie and Marilyn. In our world, we only have one or two of those people who we know by the first name. One of them is Katrina. Katrina Vanden Heuvel, all over everything, but most importantly, editor and publisher of The Nation.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm honored to be here this afternoon. Honored to be introducing Attorney General Eric Schneiderman. I'm honored to be here as a board member of the Roosevelt Institute and editor of The Nation. Thank you, Jeff, for editing, being a grand editor in the special issue. And I wouldn't be here really if it weren't for my father, because his love and respect for the Roosevelts filled our childhood. And when his parents came over in 1928 and his mother ran a boarding house in Rochester, his father worked on the French's mustard seed factory for all of his life, they learned English by listening to FDR's fireside chats. And that filled our childhood. And they always felt, my grandparents, that they had a friend in the White House. I bet millions of Americans today see a friend in Eric Schneiderman. After all, he's not only a gutsy leader who believes deeply in the good that government can do, he's actually walking the walk. Over the course of 2011, Eric Schneiderman has taken the lead in forging a new deal. A fair settlement for homeowners that holds banks accountable for their role in the foreclosure crisis that devastated the lives of millions of Americans. And he has stood tough against some very tough pressure that would crack mere mortals. But Eric's always taken on tough fights. He chaired the committee in Albany to expel a corrupt senator for the first time in modern history. And as Attorney General, he has unfailingly stayed true to what I like to call the Schneiderman rule. There will not be one set of rules for the powerful special interests and another for everyone else. Staying true to that course, he has inspired many around this country. And that inspiration in public servants, doing their jobs for the people, not rigging the system against them, is very much part of our work in restoring trust in government. Just briefly, I want to say in February 2008, Eric wrote a remarkable piece for The Nation. And I don't use that term lightly. Many elected officials and some truly remarkable people like Eleanor Roosevelt have written for The Nation. But Eric is that rare contemporary political leader who understands public service is about working for what he calls transformational change. It's not enough, as he wrote, for the politics to be merely transactional. He wrote, quote, "The difference is real and substantial. Transactional politics aims to get the best deal today. Transformational politics requires us to challenge the way people think about issues, opening their minds to better possibilities. It requires us to root out the assumptions about politics or economics or human nature that prevent us from embracing policies that will make our lives better." That need for a renewed focus on transformational politics is very clear when we look at the success of the conservative movement over the past 30 years. How it is not just won elections, but how they won. They didn't win by changing their positions. They won by moving voters closer to them and by understanding the importance of ideas and longer-term strategy. Eric also understands, and he will speak about this, the power of movements outside to build for bolder change inside. Remember FDR and the movement leaders of his time? He said to them, "Make me go out and do it," because he understood the need for that movement outside. Eric also understands, though, that corrosive cynicism, demands for instant success, can also be obstacles to effective progressive change. So it's going to take tenacious work of the people in this room, of this conference, of public servants like Eric Schneiderman, of movements like 99%ers, Occupy Wall Street, committed citizens, institutions like the Roosevelt Institute and The Nation to restore trust in government. Let me close just by remembering election night 2010. It was a pretty grim night. But on that night, Eric Schneiderman didn't fail to take his own side in an argument, something I fear too many liberals, not those in this room, often fail to do. When he spoke after winning a very tough fight to become New York's Attorney General, He said, quote, "We need to get back to the work of restoring New Yorkers' faith in government. As the party that tells people government is a force for good, as the party that tells the people the public sector can do good things." And he ended with what I take to be a call for all of us here today and the many millions around this country who care so deeply about the purpose of our country. Quote, "This is the time for big ideas, for all of the innovators, for all of the reformers, for all of the activists. This is our moment." Eric Schneiderman.
Thank you, Katrina. Thank you all. And I really want to thank the Roosevelt Institute and the Schwartz Center, personally represented here by Schwartz, who I now call Bernard, for launching such an important and promising project. I have to say that the work of the Rediscovering Government project is, and I mentioned this to Katrina before, this is the first thing I've seen since I wrote that article about the need for us to engage in transformational as well as transactional politics, where I read this and I said, oh good, finally someone's setting up a project that is exclusively devoted to us making the time, blocking out the time, dedicating the resources to doing that transformational work. And I commend you for that and look forward to working with you. I am a public official, but as I'll discuss, I recognize the first rule of American politics applies to me as well as to the president and everyone else. We get from our elected leaders what we make them give us. And that applies to our friends as well as to our enemies. Advocates and activists engaged in progressive causes usually get bogged down in day-to-day battles and usually defensive battles. I spent the morning on the radio trying to explain why we shouldn't even be in the Supreme Court over the health care legislation. Or we get consumed by the next election cycle. And the day-to-day work is tremendously important. But we can't ever afford to neglect the bigger picture work, the transformational work. The work that you are setting out to do, questioning how the public's assumptions about government and the economy have been shaped over the last 30 years, and working to reshape them, is essential. The only way we can chart a better course for the future is to do the work you're setting out to do here today. So I'm really honored to be here. And as Katrina mentioned, I wrote a piece about the distinction between transformational and transactional politics a number of years ago in The Nation. And I think it is, it's important for me to start there as the basis for my remarks today, because I do want to talk about some of what's happened and where I think we need to go in the next phase of our transformational work, and also give an example, a very positive example of success in the last year. The transactional politics, first of all, is very straightforward and very important. It's what do I have to do today to get the best deal I can get on a jobs bill or on a financial reform bill? What do I have to do to win the Supreme Court argument this week? What do I have to do to get Elizabeth Warren elected this November? That's transactional work, very important, but it requires us to be pragmatic about the state of consciousness today. Transformational work is the work we do today so that the deal we can get on jobs or financial reform or healthcare in 2 years or 5 years or 20 years is a better deal than we can get today. It is the work to change the way people think about issues, to challenge assumptions, and change the things that prevent us from doing what we should do for our own long-term self-interest. So in my view, the conservatives over the last 25 or 30 years have done some excellent transformational work, and it has been neglected over and over and over again by progressives. The opportunity we have, the reason that I said, admittedly, you speak enthusiastically after just winning a tough election, but I do believe that we have an unusual moment here, and it's an extended moment because after the crash of 2008, many progressives thought that conservative economic policies that have been ascendant for the last 30 years would simply be discredited, along with conservative foreign policies, criminal justice policies, and other areas of public policy which had proved in practice to have been catastrophic. But as the invitation to this event pointed out, The conservatives seem to have doubled down on policies that should have been repudiated, while progressive efforts to win fundamental reform at this historic juncture still have to get off the ground in many respects. But I want to talk a little bit about why I believe our efforts have been unsuccessful and how we can change that. It's clear to me that part of the reason our efforts since the crash have not been as successful as they should be is that despite this cataclysmic failure of conservative economic policies and the opening the crash provided, progressives by and large have continued to fight our policy battles on the surface. And if we're to overcome 30 years of essentially unfettered propaganda and effective transformational work, let's give credit where credit is due, we need to dig a little bit deeper. We have just seen great demonstrations of the flaws in conservative policies. But I feel that we have not effectively called out the fundamental false assumptions of the contemporary conservative movement. The conservatives understood better than we did that they were in danger, and they are in danger, of that most dreaded of progressive phenomena, a second New Deal. All right? Listen to this. A few weeks before the 2008 election, in a painful concession that a massive government bailout of our financial services sector was inevitable, the Wall Street Journal editorialized that, quote, anyone who thinks capitalism will fare better after a crash should recall that the 1930s did not end politically until 1980. It's the Wall Street Journal. They brilliantly summed up the depth of the struggle we were facing. They understood our possibilities better than we did because they understood what our predecessors in the 1930s did after how they used the last demonstration of the fundamental fallacies of conservative economic ideology to transform the United States into a far more equitable, educated, healthy, and compassionate nation. So let's be clear on what was and is at stake. The most important thing about the New Deal and why its influence stretched from Roosevelt to Reagan and beyond was that its architects did not view it as a set of public works projects. They recognized that their most significant work was in transforming America's basic sense of our collective life and our understanding of the role of government in creating wealth and poverty. And their success led to decades of strong economic growth, broadly shared prosperity, until the resurgence of the conservative movements with this neoclassical supply-side nonsense in the 1980s, which brought us back to the state pre-1929 where markets crash every 10 or 20 years and have since Isaac Newton lost all his money. But after the 2008 crashes in the 1930s, we've been given an opportunity to shift the way in which Americans understand our political and economic life. It is only an opportunity, but it is still before us. What we have to do, though, is, again, let's dig down deep and see how deeply the assumptions that Americans used to understand their world have been changed by this unfettered propaganda teaching that less regulation means more growth and that cutting taxes always creates jobs. We have to recognize that what's happened is even more insidious than undermining faith in the government in order to shrink the government. What's happened is that Americans have been convinced that there is a natural order of things, a magical market that exists independent of government, in which everyone competes, everyone is out for their own interests, and those who are the smartest and most talented, the hardest working, reap the rewards. According to this view, extreme concentration of wealth is natural, and those individuals who have wealth are deserving of it. It's like the conservatives are pretending they have found some missing pages of Genesis that the rest of us are missing. Some section of scripture in which God created separate tax rates for capital gains or carried interests. Well, I've read Genesis, and God did not create our financial markets. They are created by law and regulation. The distribution of wealth is not determined by nature. It is determined by public policy. In Leviticus, we are told to refrain from many things. We're told that we're not to eat shrimp. There is no admonition preventing us from regulating derivatives or restricting subprime mortgages. Go read it for yourself. It's a boring section of the book, but it's worth checking. Because under the cover of this story that rewards naturally flow to those who are most deserving, what has actually happened is not a shrinking of government. Government grew substantially under every Republican administration since Reagan, but rather a shift in who government serves. So instead of implementing policies that promote the general welfare and broadly shared prosperity, as it did in the decades following the New Deal, our public policy for the last 3 decades has increasingly shifted to the promotion of the transfer of wealth from the poor and middle class to the rich. And the blame for the declining fortunes of the middle class has been shifted onto government programs that actually seek to help such people. Basic safety net programs such as food stamps, unemployment benefits, and Head Start have been presented as unnatural interventions in God's plan for social inequality. And often, these presentations are tinged in racial terms and other frameworks that appeal to people's fears. So as we know, while the safety net policies that benefit the 99% have been slashed, policies that benefit the very wealthiest Americans have continued to move forward at a breakneck pace, and predictably, we've seen a massive increase in inequality. I'm sure you've heard about it today from those who are smarter on such matters than I am, but it is still bracing to consider that the top 1% of Americans hold over 40% of the nation's wealth. But I suggest that the key thing for us to understand and convey as we undertake this effort to rediscover government is that this unprecedented accumulation of wealth and rising inequality did not result from a natural order or from less government. It resulted from government policies whose goal was to promote the accumulation of wealth and rising inequality. So the decline of faith in government and your work to turn that around is not just because the public has been told that government is the problem, but because most Americans now have seen, with each passing decade, government serving their interests less and less. And I'd suggest that what we all have to do collectively over the years ahead of us is not just to change how people understand the role of government, but to help people see that it is not an unnatural intervention in some fantasy-free market for government to serve someone other than the most fortunate. And we also have to work to make sure that, in fact, government does serve all of us. One of the things Katrina was referring to earlier is a very important principle for progressives, and I tell this to my colleagues in public office over and over again. If we are going to be the people who tell the public that the public sector is a force for good, we have to be the harshest critics of waste, fraud, and corruption in the public sector. That we don't do anyone any good by covering up or turning a blind eye to programs that don't work. And in my office, if there's one area where we have put the most resources and made the most changes, it's to reinforce our efforts at rooting out public corruption and making sure that government programs are run well and deliver for the people we promise we are going to help. Now let me turn to a specific example that in fact is a very positive example of good transformational work over the last year. As some of you know, I spent a lot of time investigating, since I got into office, the bubble and the crash of the mortgage-backed securities market that brought down the American economy, brought down the world's economy. In the aftermath of the crash, there was a really sort of a stunned reaction. And a lot of Americans were left not just feeling that they had been ripped off, that they had gone from a nation of savers to a nation of investors only to wake up in a rigged casino. There were a lot of people who felt that there was no accountability and there was going to be no accountability. So I took office and, as I'll discuss, I launched an investigation into the whole mortgage mess. One of my primary goals was to restore public confidence that there would be accountability. And another goal really was simply to get everything out in the open to make sure that the other side couldn't rewrite history. It is unbelievable, and it gets at the heart of our efforts to fight back against the conservative narrative. I mean, at least after 1929, they had the decency to slink away for 50 years or so and take their neoclassical supply-side garbage and go do something else until the 1980s when they returned with Ronald Reagan and David Stockman and started to sell the same old stuff with the same old result. Listen, over the last couple of years, state and local governments have had fiscal crises that were the direct result of the recession. Tax revenues collapsed, but the conservatives got out there very quickly saying our deficits were the result of spending too much on teachers or police or firefighters, or even they were the result of too much regulation. Well, I can't comment on the details of an ongoing investigation, but I assure you, we have uncovered no evidence that teachers or firefighters or sanitation workers or any other public employees were the cause of the collapse of the American economy. And in fact, I have learned, and it's not a secret, it's all been made public, I've learned a lot about what led to the crash, and I think it's unassailable that it was caused by reckless deregulation, which set the stage for irresponsible and in some cases illegal conduct in the mortgage market, and by a relatively small number of players in financial services. The deregulatory history is uncontested, and it's important for us to be clear with ourselves and convey to the public what happened. It's well known that the Glass-Steagall Act separating commercial banks from investment banks was repealed in 1999. The refusal to regulate derivatives was not enshrined in Leviticus, but in fact was in the Commodities Future Modernization Act of 2000. And there was a conscious determination made not to regulate what came to be known by the wholesome phrase of over-the-counter derivatives, which sounds kind of innocuous, right? It's like buying Advil, which were at the heart of the financial crisis. In November 2001, federal bank regulators changed the risk rating system for mortgage-backed securities. And mortgage-backed securities are just pools of mortgages, and you can buy a share of the stream of income from the mortgages when you buy a share of the mortgage-backed securities. Good investments for decades. But when the rules were changed so the banks didn't have to set aside the capital to protect people in case there were a lot of defaults on those mortgages, things got riskier. And finally, the stage was really set by a failure to rein in predatory loans in spite of the fact that states were pleading with Congress to tighten the reins on subprime lenders. This is very important. Congress refused to do so, and states started to pass their own anti-predatory lending laws only to have them wiped away by the Bush administration under the federal doctrine of preemption. In February 2004, the controller of the currency officially exempted national banks from state laws regulating mortgage credit, including anti-predatory lending laws. So mortgage-backed securities that have been good investments for years, in the early years of the last decade, interest rates were low. Lots of renters said, well, I could do better buying and getting a mortgage. Lots of people said I should refinance my old mortgage. There were lots of mortgages being written, and there were lots of mortgages to put into pools to sell as mortgage-backed securities. It was good business. And then interest rates started to go up, and fewer people were interested in taking out mortgages. And that meant there were fewer mortgages to put in the pools and fewer mortgage-backed securities for people to make money on. So instead of the market cooling off, what happened is they lowered the standards for loans. And you can track the percentage of interest-only and negative amortization loans where the amount you owe actually increases every month, even though you're making payments, which went from about 6% of the market in 2003 to about 30% of the market in 2005. The move to no documentation loans and what came to be known as liar loans, where things were just made up about your ability to pay. There were tens of thousands of mortgages given in these years to people who never even made one payment. So it's pretty clear what was happening on the lending side. And then on the securitization side, when they couldn't sell regular mortgage-backed securities, they started to expand the use of, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but of collateralized debt obligations, much more opaque instruments for pooling mortgages, harder for people to understand, harder for people to rate. And in short, shoddy lending practices and opaque financial engineering drove housing prices upward during the bubble years, far higher than they should have been. And when the bubble finally burst, as we all know, millions of jobs disappeared. American pensions funds immediately lost about $1.3 trillion in retirement assets. The wealth of the middle class, which was in the equity in their homes, evaporated. Over $7 trillion in home equity was lost. And the U.S. economy fell into the longest and deepest recession since the 30s. So we know a lot about what caused the bubble and the crash, but when I came into office in early 2011, all 50 state attorneys general, or most of them, had gotten together to try and negotiate a settlement with the largest banks over abuses in the servicing of mortgages and in the foreclosure process, and had a deal on the table that, in my view, was totally inadequate. And when I started to engage with my fellow attorneys general who were negotiating, it became clear to me that what the banks wanted in exchange for reforms to the way they handled mortgages and a relatively narrow settlement to improve foreclosure standards was a broad release from virtually all misconduct, including some of the conduct that actually blew up the economy. And to me, this made no sense, and I was newly elected and viewed myself as a part of a movement, not just an isolated elected official. And I knew it was good to have a servicing settlement. It's good to have stronger rules of the road for services and get principal reductions for some homeowners. But I drew a hard line and took the position that I wasn't going to give up claims that hadn't been fully investigated, and I certainly wasn't going to let these guys off for conduct that contributed to the meltdown of the economy based on a settlement that addressed issues like robo-signing. So I began my own investigation, and I began talking to some of my colleagues, but to tell you the truth, I was pretty isolated. Last year in March, April, May, this was tough going. And then, ladies and gentlemen, a lot of people got involved in some amazing transformational political work, and it is important to appreciate what happened between last spring and the beginning of this year. Occupy Wall Street was just the most flamboyant manifestation of what I think was a much broader and deeper phenomenon. And a lot of people treat Occupy as sort of something that's isolated by itself, an unusual group of people. To me, Occupy, because I traveled around the state campaigning for over a year, talking to regular New Yorkers in Buffalo and Syracuse and Rochester and all over the state and Long Island and the North Country, and continue to travel around as a new Attorney General. I have 13 regional offices, and I heard the same sense that a lack of accountability, the same sense that this rising inequality was objectionable and that they weren't sure what happened or what they could do about it, but it wasn't sitting right with them. There's something wrong. I heard this from everyone. People would never dream of coming down to Zagati Park. This was just the most visible tip of a huge iceberg of discontent with what had happened in the American economy and in American society. So this incredible public outcry rose up, and my efforts to get more from the banks while giving up fewer future claims picked up support. Labor unions rose up and came to help me. Unite Here, SEIU, other unions in the AFL-CIO, housing advocates like the Center for Responsible Lending, the Neighborhood Economic Development Project, National People's Action, civil rights organizations like the NAACP and the National Council of La Raza, and progressive activist groups like Move On and Credo. Dozens of other groups, lots of progressive members of Congress, just random officials started calling me up because they heard about this from different parts of the country. And the sense grew that popular sentiment in America had shifted and was very visible, that we shouldn't be letting people off the hook for the conduct that blew up the economy, and that people were demanding a return to this great idea that has made a great comeback called equal justice under law. And ultimately, it was the work of these activists and the transformation of the debate that allow us to move my colleagues, that allowed us to move agencies in the federal government and obtain the changes we needed in the multi-state settlement. And that transformational work, ladies and gentlemen, led the president on the biggest stage of all, the State of the Union address, to say something he had not said before. Quote, everyone deserves a fair shot, everyone should pay their fair share, and there has to be one set of rules for everyone. Good work. Thank you all very much. As an elected official who knows we get from elected officials what we make them give us, thank you for helping us to do the right thing. He backed up his statement by creating an unprecedented joint federal-state working group to investigate some of this misconduct that brought down the economy, and actually made me one of the co-chairs of the working group. So due to this transformational movement building, not because my arguments got any better, my arguments were the same, I probably just got a little more shrill, but because this popular sentiment was expressed so clearly and so strongly, I went from being very much of an outsider to being brought in to help them frame up an investigation that should really, hopefully, produce some very good results in the months ahead. As progress doesn't happen, ladies and gentlemen, because of who you elect, it's good to elect friends, but it happens when you build movements to empower those of us in office to do the right thing. And I think it's very important that as you set about this project of rediscovering government, as you set about this wonderful project to intentionally promote transformational political work, that we bear in mind that TV shows and movies love the great man theory of history, right? It's all about electing someone. It's a fatal flaw for progressives, right? We think, well, we elect someone good and then we leave and let them handle it. The Republicans beat us twice for president with a guy who couldn't even string two sentences together. How little they value that very, very tip of the pyramid, which is the elected official. It's the movement that sustains them. It's the movement that empowers progressive elected officials that is what is important. And as you seek to rediscover government, I hope that you're going to maintain true to that principle, that we're going to rediscover all the things that enable government to work. And part of that is electing good people, but it's useless if you don't have the other parts. Great strides in social justice don't come out because of politicians, they come out because of movements. And if you look at history, great movements usually start a long time before public elected officials get on board. So thanks to the progressive movement that happened, our final servicing settlement gave up very little in the way of legal immunity in exchange for some immediate relief for homeowners, better rules against abuses for people who need them right now. And we are going to provide resources to the hardest hit immunities immediately, particularly in New York, where we have pretty good laws to protect you if you're being wrongfully foreclosed on. We're focused on the fact that those laws weren't doing anyone any good because we cut all the funding for legal services. So in the budget deal that was announced last night, I think, and as the details of that come out, you will see that because of what we were able to obtain in the settlement, we are now starting the process of rebuilding legal services in the state of New York so that no one in our state is ever foreclosed on because they didn't have a lawyer to help them understand their rights. That's the first step of the settlement. And as I've repeatedly said, if this is all we do, it's not enough. It's a failure. This is just a down payment. There is much more to do. There's a broad range of claims that we've preserved, including all claims for criminal conduct. So the work of our joint investigation goes forward, the work that I'm doing in my office and that I'm trying to help other attorneys general take on around the country, and helping my federal counterparts or working with my federal counterparts as they seek to do a better job of digging in. This work all still has to happen. But again, I'm not under the illusion that we're going to sustain this or these efforts will go forward unless we continue to do the movement building, to provide the public base of support, to have people continuing to urge us that we have to use every opportunity to reinforce the quintessentially American ideal that our national mission is to move with every decade, with every generation, towards greater equality, to move towards the ideal of equal justice under law. And if you're able to help get us back on track there, if you're able to help focus folks taking some of their time away from the transactional politics of day-to-day struggles on this transformational work, you will make an incredible contribution to our country and really, I think, to the people today and people who, the best thing about building movements is you're helping a lot of people who won't even know who you are, which I kind of like. Some people want to get thanks immediately. I think building for the long term has a different kind of a satisfaction, and I hope that you'll be able to maintain that long-term perspective. Let's go forward together from this. Good to have a moment to say we had a good, successful last 6 months of last year. That doesn't excuse us from doing our work this year. I have no illusions that we're going to get any more by way of an investigation and an aggressive approach to these problems. If we drop the movement building, we're not. So we need to keep going. We need to keep building popular support. But let's go forward together, continue to set the record straight about what happened, about the role of conservative deregulation in creating this crisis, and the need for and ability of the government to hold people accountable who engaged in misconduct. By demonstrating that government can and will enforce one set of rules for everyone and protect the interests of all Americans, not just the most fortunate, we begin the process of transforming people's awareness of themselves and our collective life. And if we do this work, we can put to rest the deep fallacies that have allowed inequality and injustice to grow unchecked for so long, and we can begin to rediscover the potential of government to get us back in touch, to start building, as our counterparts in the 30s did, a more equitable, educated, healthy, and compassionate nation. And I could not be more pleased that you're launching this project. I thank you. I look forward to working with you on it and for letting me be here today and be a partner with you in this effort.